bringing you up to speed on the latest in conservation, science, and responsible hunting in Canada. Hey everyone, it's Mark Hall, and you're listening to the Round Canada podcast. So Dana's off camping this week, so I'm flying solo here on the Around Canada podcast. So this is a episode that's kind of stories are skewed to the West Coast in Canada, and it's a lot of really weird stories. Just the collection of things that have been happening over the last month is a little on the weird side. Lots to do with predators and whatnot. So the lead story is about this grizzly bear that was on Texada Island. Texada Island is just off the coast of British Columbia, between the mainland and Vancouver Island. So this younger grizzly bear, male, about 4 years old, had swum over to the island. Not uncommon. They've actually swum all the way over to Vancouver Island itself, but they do get on to some of the archipelago islands. And so this bear, they named him Tex because he was on Texada Island. He had been a case bear for the BC Conservation Officer Service on the mainland. Typical young bear out trying to carve out a place in life for itself, to find a territory, to become a dominant bear and find some breeding females, just that whole dynamic. And those are the bears that are in the category that tend to get into trouble with people because they're searching for a place. They're bumping into settlements and camps and people and this sort of stuff. So this bear had a history, couple times, confrontations with people, and swam over to the island. And people started to be concerned that this bear was there. It had not necessarily like outright conflicts. It was documented or reported that it was chasing some livestock, didn't kill any livestock, following some people, out walking on a country road, that sort of thing. And anyways, it became kind of a big story. Everybody wanted to save the bears. The conservation officers service said they were monitoring the situation. They weren't necessarily going to go immediately kill the bear, as long as it didn't, get into more trouble there. But it wasn't a candidate for relocation because it had been in trouble before. That's just the policy for dangerous wildlife in the province of British Columbia. So anyways, this whole thing started in the media about the Grizzly Bear Foundation wanting to work with some First Nations on the coast and relocate this grizzly bear like they did back in 2020. I'll talk about that in a second. And so all of this was happening, all these conversations between the Grizzly Bear Foundation and the government and these First Nations that were willing to accept this bear into their traditional territories. And plans were starting to be put in place to move a trap onto the island. So all this was kind of weird outside the normal process for managing grizzly bear and people sort of issues in the province. The thing that I foresaw that was happening is it didn't appear that they were including people on Texada Island. They weren't listening to the people. They weren't hearing out their concerns, their fears, these sorts of things. And apparently the day the trap showed up on the island, RCMP got a call. Grizzly bear had been shot, wounded. BC conservation officers went onto the island and located the dead bear. And so what happened, I'm reading into this, but I think what happened is people were frustrated that the islanders were living there. This bear was there. There had been a little bit of escalation in bear-human livestock encounters, but all of this conversation about what to do with the bear wasn't including them. It was being held in Victoria, like in the urban center and in, the minister's office, that sort of thing. And I think somebody just got fed up, likely that somebody got fed up that this was dragging on and nobody was doing anything. And before something bad happened, being that a person was mauled, that somebody said, I'm sick of this. when they shot the bear. Still illegal. So conservation officers are investigating. But for me, the media attention, the Grizzly Bear Foundation, all these, folks that were in the media being interviewed were concerned about the grizzly bear and this individual, this one male Tex. And for me, this isn't a story about a lone grizzly bear. This is a story about how the system failed the people of Texada Island, and they were left out. And it doesn't matter where we look in the world, whether it's rural Africa, India, anywhere where rural people are living in close proximity and living with the consequences of these large, dangerous animals. In Africa, it can be lions, leopards, elephants, like are the big ones. India, leopards, tigers, elephants, that when they're left out and their livelihoods, their livestock, their families, their communities are threatened, people are people anywhere in the world. And when they get fed up with the authorities or outsiders messing in their affairs, they take matters into their own hands. And I don't think Canada is any different than anywhere else in the world. The fundamental values of people wanting to protect their livelihoods themselves doesn't, we're not above that in Canada. And I think that's, likely what happened. And it's not unnatural, I think, for people to be concerned about that. Doesn't mean people hate grizzly bears, but I think they're concerned about this thing living in and around them in very close proximity. And our species evolved to be concerned and eyes wide open when it comes to large, dangerous animals on the landscape. If it wasn't genetically a part of our brain to be concerned or take matters into our own hands, I don't think we'd be sitting here today doing this podcast, because humans wouldn't have made it. And I think every animal that's on the planet today has successfully navigated that evolutionary chain to be hyper aware of predators or things that are dangerous to their welfare. And they take matters into their own hands, either by proactively attacking and killing the threat or just getting the heck out of Dodge, so to speak. And those are probably the two fundamental, mechanisms. Maybe hiding, camouflage, those types of things are evolutionary, but it's natural. And I think what happened on Texada Island was just a natural human response that was made worse by the fact that a bunch of outside organizations like the Grizzly Bear Foundation were meddling in the people's lives on Texada Island. And, this isn't the first time that the Grizzly Bear Foundation has done this, that has, put people at risk. Back in 2020, there was another island off of the Vancouver Island and the coast, one of the archipelago islands, that a grizzly bear had swum out to. They named him Mally, and he, same thing, been in trouble before, started to get into, garbage, habituated bear. And the conservation officers wanted to go in and lethally remove this bear before something bad happened, being an attack on a human. And the Grizzly Bear Foundation got involved, started lobbying the Minister of Environment, who oversees the Conservation Officer Service, an individual from a First Nations individual from a bear viewing, wildlife, whale watching business on the coast, also got involved and said, look, I don't want this bear killed. You need to move this grizzly bear, and at the expense of the province, tranquilize it, and fly it up to, a more remote area. And so, this is what really concerns me about the way the Grizzly Bear Foundation is operating in British Columbia, is they got influence, political influence, with the Minister of Environment. And so I think to the Conservation Officer Service and their policy, it was very clear. It's in their mandate that public safety is paramount. If a BC Conservation Officer Service receives 10 calls, dead animal, poaching, anything, threat to human life, that always takes precedent, and they will go to a call or a location where humans are at risk from any wildlife. And I think that's what it was. They have policy, and it was like, nope, this bear needs to be removed before it attacks or kills somebody. And my read on the situation is because of the Grizzly Bear Foundation lobbying directly to the minister, George Heyman at the time, was probably putting political pressure or overrode the chief of the Conservation Officer Service. And the province mobilized, captured this bear, flew it 30 kilometers away back onto the mainland. Within a couple of weeks, this grizzly bear had a confrontation with a person in a remote area of the coast. Luckily, the person was armed and killed the grizzly bear. And the Conservation Officer Service was right. They called it. The Grizzly Bear Foundation got involved. They have leverage with the minister, and they basically just about killed somebody. And I don't know if they actually care about public safety when it comes to these problem bears. And at some part, coexistence means that bears need to be killed. That is part of the coexistence model. And, I was listening to the Grizzly Bear Foundation has a podcast, and this was from 2020, just after this happened. It's episode 3, if I recall correctly. They were talking about this story, and this was before the bear was killed. And they were actually laughing on the podcast that they were able to be sitting there in real time texting the Minister of Environment while conversations were happening on the side with the chief of the BC Conservation Officer Service. They were literally laughing over the influence that they had through the minister being able to directly text the individual. Then the whole thing, I believe, unfolded like the way I said. Then the minister overrode the chief of the Conservation Officer Service and had this bear moved. And that's just a terrible situation to be in this province, or anywhere for that fact, where there's grizzly bears and people. Part of the issue for me is bears have ended up dead. It was a ban on grizzly bear hunting in BC back in 2018, and that was touted as being the thing that was going to safeguard grizzly bears now that hunting was over, because these hunters were horrible people. They were killing bears, and so we stopped hunting. What's happening? Bears are being killed in the province at record pace on highways, rails, and in these situations where they're being destroyed legally by the Conservation Officer Service because they're getting into conflict, or people are just being fed up, and their retaliation killings is what they're known around the world as. And the unfortunate part about that is these bears have no value. They're killed. They're left to rot. They're buried in some cases. I know that's happened near where I live. Big excavator digs a hole and pushes the bear in it. Or they're packed off somewhere and dumped off of a steep logging road into some brushy area somewhere to decompose. There's no value to a dead bear when that happens. Hunters value the bear. They value the opportunity to hunt, to be out there. If they get a bear, they're going to utilize it. And in the grand scheme, from the bear's perspective, whether or not a human utilizes them or not is probably irrelevant. A dead bear is a dead bear. But I think from a human value perspective, if an animal is going to die and someone can make use of that, and yeah, that is the fur, that is maybe getting something done taxidermy wise. It is putting the skull on your mantle and remembering and honoring the bear and utilizing the meat. And yes, hunters do eat grizzly bear meat. I've eaten it. There's nothing wrong with it. So we're in a position in British Columbia now where this story is unfolding a lot, directly due to the interference of the Grizzly Bear Foundation at the highest levels in the province, and they are completely leaving local people out of the conversations. The Grizzly Bear Foundation is backed by a multi-millionaire land developer out of the Whistler area, probably so disconnected from rural life, it's not even funny. And to me, what sums up the way the Grizzly Bear Foundation is operating in the province of BC is they're so concerned about bears. They're so concerned about one individual bear, whether it's Tex or whether it's Mally or whoever it happens to be next time. They're not concerned about populations, and I don't think they're concerned about rural people. And I go back to a famous section of the original movie of Shrek. And I think this is probably the mantra of the Grizzly Bear Foundation when it comes to this sort of thing. Some of you may die, but it's a risk I'm willing to accept. Lord Farquaad. And these stories just seem to be that way. That seems to be what's happening. Now, following on the heels of this story, another grizzly bear. This time, somebody was attacked. Pretty serious attack. This happened about an hour from where I live in the Creston Valley of southern British Columbia. Creston's a little farming community, rich soils along the Kootenay River, borders right on the international boundary. The main croplands on the west side of the Kootenay River are pulse crops. There's hay crops, but there's pulse crops, so like peas and a lot of corn. There's a dairy industry there that uses a lot of corn silage. And since grizzly bear hunting was stopped, more grizzly bears have moved out of the mountainous and the hilly country, and they've literally taken up residence in the river bottom, and they're wandering around in these fields because there's food there. And I've hunted ducks and geese over there. It's a phenomenal place. You got the river, and right beside it, you've got corn and peas in these cut crops. Beautiful place. But people that do hunt there can literally be sitting there looking out into their decoy spread and have a grizzly bear go by in the field. I don't know where in North America you can be in a farmer's field hunting ducks or geese and have a grizzly bear checking out your decoys. So it's a strange situation. Yes, the river bottom before the farm fields were there would have been all brush and cottonwood, riparian forest, probably a good place for a grizzly bear to live. People live there now, people farm there, and the grizzly bears have moved back in. In May, there was a big community initiative to start educating people on how to coexist with grizzly bears that are now living in the Creston area. Not a bad thing. Let's not make the situation worse by having food attractants out for these grizzly bears, because then they're attracted to areas that either they become a risk and they're killed or somebody gets hurt. That's what happened last week. A couple was going out on a mountain bike trip. They ran into two grizzly bears. They pulled their bear spray out. They used it. The wife used her bear spray, I think, on both bears. Her husband was seriously mauled. He was moved by paramedics to the hospital, had a bunch of surgeries, and apparently now is in a stable condition. A few years ago, somebody was kayaking on the Kootenay River, which is like right beside these farm fields, pulled up on a beachy area for the night to set up a camp, and bam, a grizzly bear came out and attacked the person on the beach area where he was in his camp. So it's a crazy situation in the Creston Valley area. I've also learned that grizzly bear scientists that are researching the movement of grizzly bears in southern British Columbia are identifying, the corridors that, we need to connect so bears can move from one mountain range to the other through the valley bottom. And this concern was pointed out to me recently that the Creston Valley is one of the places that's identified that they want conservation organizations to be involved with, like land purchases and, different things that they do to keep the movement of animals, through a settled area, a connective corridor. They want a connective corridor right through this area where people are farming, living, and the town of Creston for grizzly bears that are moving from one mountain range to the other through the Creston Valley. And yeah, maybe the bears like to move through there. It's convenient, but to actually, sort of facilitate moving bears into this area when they don't have a handle on the attractants in and around rural people's homes and just the basic attractants, which you can't do anything about in an agriculture situation. I don't know if that's the right thing to do, to actually be exacerbating the situation of bears being right on top of people. Anyways, like, this seems to be another one of those, those cases where grizzly bears are up here on a pedestal and people are down here. And in the case of the Creston Valley, people are getting attacked. And it's been 2 cases that I know of in the last few years, and it's probably not going to be the last. So the 2 bears that attacked the individual last week, the husband and wife, the BC Conservation Officer Service determined that it was a defensive attack, and so they're not going to pursue trapping and destroying these bears. I don't know about that, but anyways, BC Conservation Officer Service are following their policy, and if anything, at least follow your policy. If something happens with these 2 bears again, probably siblings, maybe like 3 or 4 years old, unless the Grizzly Bear Foundation gets involved, those bears will probably be removed, and hopefully that will prevent somebody from being more seriously mauled or killed the next time around. On the topic, on the category of animals attacking people in northern British Columbia, around the town of Smithers, which I grew up in, graduated from high school there. A man was out near Lake Cathlin, which I used to go to as a teenager, and this individual was out there recreating and got jumped by a cougar and scratched in his upper body. Funny part of the story is the guy punched the cougar in the face, and immediately the cougar reacted to that and turned and took off. So luckily, nothing too bad happened there. It's interesting. Cougars actually carry diseases that can be fatal to humans. There was a case a number of years ago down in the States where a biologist was doing a necropsy on a dead cougar, actually inhaled, I don't know, it was a virus or a bacteria that was on the cougar's carcass. They're known to have this. And I think within 24 hours, the guy was dead. Another thing, I know that happens with leopards and lions and stuff overseas, but they carry a bacteria in their claws because there's decomposing meat packed into the base of the claws, and there's a bacteria that gets in that if those animals scratch and break the skin and that bacteria gets into your bloodstream, goes toxic and can kill you. So I don't know if that's something that happens with cougars just because of the climate here in British Columbia, but at least this individual would have got to a hospital, probably tested and cleaned up for that. Not maybe the case if you're in a tropical, hot, warm, humid climate in India or in rural Africa. So sounds like the person's going to be okay, but kind of a strange story that a cougar just immediately kind of burst out and jumped on this fella. So switching gears to fisheries, this is another West Coast thing, and it's just kind of a weirdness that seems to be happening on the West Coast right now. So a man that lives on Gabriola Island, so again, another one of these archipelago islands that sits between mainland British Columbia and Vancouver Island, was recently convicted of another violation of the Federal Fisheries Act for poaching. This fella is known to authorities, and I think I've covered this story before. The last conviction he had was for poaching sea cucumbers off the coast of British Columbia, caught by Department of Fisheries and Oceans and charged. And this second set of charges, this fellow was recently sentenced to 6 years in jail and ordered to pay $1.1 million in fines. The likelihood that he'll be able to pay the fines is probably next to zero, but this person's going to spend 6 years in jail. Interestingly enough, the judge in this case, Justice David Crerar, BC Supreme Court judge, noted in his ruling that the Crown understands that Mr. Steer's records to be the longest record of Fisheries Act violations in Canadian history, dating back to prior to 2008. The judge in his verdict said this, quote unquote, he shows contempt for the fishermen who follow the rules. He shows contempt for the laws of Parliament and the orders of the court. He shows contempt for the efforts of past courts to steer him towards an honest path through less severe sanctions that rely on his honesty and compliance. The only way to stop Mr. Steer from ravaging the ocean and flouting the law and court's orders is to move him far from the sea for a long period of time. A significant period of incarceration is not only proportionate and just, but necessary. Whoa. So that, I almost wondered if that's got to be like a record court sentence in Canada as well for a record convicted poacher. I remember covering this story before, and one of the things that was bizarre about the way the federal fisheries laws operate in Canada, like if you're a commercial fisherman, I don't know if it's a recreational fisherman too. If you're caught doing something illegal, and I believe this is for commercial operators, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a license to operate in a particular management zone in Canada for a certain, marine species and a quota. If you're found violating that, the conviction is for the zone that you're in. So I think what's happened before is these commercial operators then pick up a license and move to another zone, and they're completely legit to carry on operations, even though they're a known convicted poacher in another zone. I vaguely remember that being something that I covered in the story on this fella a couple of years ago. So kind of a weird loophole if that is the situation in Canada's Federal Fisheries Act, which would be good to fix. Whether you're on one coast or the other, a conviction is a conviction, and you should have all your rights or commercial licenses suspended, no matter where you're convicted under the Federal Fisheries Act in Canada. What do you think? This is another weird story about a convicted poacher. This was to do with duck hunting. So this fella was from Washington State. He's a resident there. He operated a guide service company called Mayhem Services. He was caught in Canada poaching ducks. So he was bringing up duck hunters, like paying clients, and illegally operating in British Columbia, guiding these foreign hunters where he didn't have a guide license in the province. So he admitted to doing this in a U.S. court, illegally duck hunting in Canada. The U.S. has this really powerful legislation called the Lacey Act, whereas if you're convicted of doing something illegal and then transporting the illegally harvested fish, wildlife, waterfowl across the state line, the Lacey Act federal kicks into place, and the full force of federal law drops on an individual, even if they were doing from a particular state. So this fella pleaded guilty in a Washington state court, a U.S. court, to violating the Lacey Act. So he admitted to violating federal laws, meaning he transported this illegal ducks out of British Columbia into the U.S. across state lines. U.S. courts, federal courts, fined him $175,000 for that. The crazy part about this is what he was coming into British Columbia for was these clients that he had were, I guess, collectors, trophy duck hunters, I guess, if you want to call it that. And they were after the harlequin duck. So in Washington, they're not allowed to hunt them because they're not an overly prolific migratory waterfowl duck. They live primarily in mountain streams. They're rapidly flowing, cascading mountain streams. And these little harlequin ducks, they're probably, in the category of beautiful plumage like the wood duck. And they are, you can hunt them here in British Columbia. And so that's what they were up here for, is they were trying to get this checked off the list of these hunters. And so they were illegally hunting the harlequin duck. So wasn't that they were just coming up after the abundance of, waterfowl and have a good time hunting ducks or geese or whatever. They were specifically targeting these less common harlequin ducks, basically as a, check the box type hunt. Pretty weird. Back to grizzly bears. This was in Alberta. A Calgary couple was out on a hike recently in the Kananaskis area, and a young grizzly bear stepped out on the trail in front of them, started approaching them. They were backing up, and the bear started to make some kind of like bluff charges at them, and they had their bear spray out. They managed to get out from this unscathed, but they this is kind of weird. They pulled out their phone and videotaped this bear on the trail in front of them, and glad nothing happened to them. But I could read the situation. I think what was my interpretation, if I would have been there, this is how I read the situation. Couple were walking up the trail. The bear came out on the trail, wanted to travel on the trail towards them. So two parties wanting to use the same trail, easy walking, but go in different directions. And the bear didn't like these folks being there. They were kept backing up, but it was in the direction that the bear was heading, and they weren't getting out of the bear's way. And so the bear started to get aggravated, and you could see it. It started to hang its head low. It was kind of looking, and then it would burst into this kind of where they flare up and they got their paws up and they kind of like make themselves look big, kind of like flared out like a flying squirrel kind of look to them. Sort of a classic aggressive display on behalf of a grizzly bear doing that. And, if it would have been me, I would have just done a right turn and headed off into the bushes and cleared the trail. I think the bear just would have walked right on by and given him a little bit of time, got onto the trail. Part of the problem would have been is then the bear is between you and your vehicle. But I've had to do this. I've had to make great big circuits through the bush, like 2-kilometer loops to get around a bear back to my vehicle, just simply to stay out of the path that the bear has made it clear to me. You need to move because I want to go here. I'm not one to argue with that. I think that's maybe a mistake, maybe a lesson for this couple in Calgary to have learned. But as part of the value, I think, of actually being a bear hunter is you get to have so many cool encounters to learn about bears, their behavior, the nuances, body language. Sometimes things are fairly subtle, and it pays off in these types of situations where I think you can read what's in the bear's mind. Had an encounter one time with a sow grizzly bear and her little cub, and I could basically tell the distance, her behavior, the way she was looking at me, that she was giving me the 3-second count to get out of the way, to leave. And if I hadn't have read that in her mind, she probably would have been time's up, and boom, within a split second, she probably would have been on top of me. So if you want to learn about traveling in bear country safely, go out with a hunter for a while. And one of the stories that have recently come back to me through my community here about this couple that was attacked in Creston, there was an individual talking to my wife that was there and saw the couple getting their bikes ready and said was probably within a few hours of the attack. He started down the trail after the couple went in there later on and said, yeah, there was fresh grizzly bear poop on the trail. There you go. A hunter would have known there's a bear in the area, been able to tell if the bear hunter wanted to hunt the bear, then he probably would have stayed there. If the bear hunter was going out berry picking with his family in the off season, probably would have read that and said, let's go somewhere else. Where the average person that doesn't understand these types of things are able to read scat. Hunters got degrees in scatology or poopology. They didn't know to take this as a clue and the freshness of it and not go bike riding there. So again, hopefully another good lesson for the couple in Creston. Wish that fella all the best in his recovery. Now, another bear story down on the lower mainland, North Vancouver area. So there was this fella, 59 years old, kind of the same age as I am, was convicted of 2 counts of the Wildlife Act for feeding dangerous animals. So a person found out that this fella was hauling in massive amounts of food, including meat, into an area in the bushes and stockpiling it for bears and coyotes to feed on. They confronted the person, called the BC Conservation Officer Service. They came and set up some secret cameras, caught this individual, caught up with them, laid the charges. In the first court appearance, this fella denied that his actions were meant to attract dangerous animals that weren't already living in the woods. What does that statement mean? I wasn't trying to attract dangerous animals that weren't already living in the woods. So he was meant to attract dangerous animals from somewhere else, like outside the province, outside the country. Like, I don't know what that means. Anyways, that argument didn't fly and he was charged and he was supposed to show up for his sentence hearing, which most likely would have been a fine. And he didn't show up at the sentence hearing, which was just a couple of weeks ago. So he was supposed to have shown up again in court, I think a couple of days ago, the 29th or whatever. If he didn't show up then, I'd have a warrant for his arrest issued. That's what you get for feeding the bears. Wolf story out of Alberta. There's a lone wolf in the Kananaskis area. So the Kananaskis country is where everybody goes to recreate. That's where the G7 summit was this spring, where they sent all these volunteers in to like strip the whole entire area of berries so that they wouldn't attract bears when all the G7 country leaders came in. That sort of seemed to piss people off that was happening just for this leader summit. Anyways, there's a wolf in the Kananaskis area that appears to have lost its fear of people. It's approaching people. They suspect maybe that it's been getting handouts or, these sorts of things. Alberta Parks has issued warnings about it and are trying to track down this individual wolf, which they haven't been able to find. I don't think they're, it's smart to kill it right now. But I think they realize there's a situation happening here that's not good. Again, kind of one of these things where it's like you hear these stories coming out of national parks and parks areas and the big urban populated areas, which just lack common sense, like people feeding wolves in a recreational area. It's like, yeah, that leads to bad stuff happening. The other aspect of the story that I find kind of intriguing is just all these stories that are in the national news in Canada that are always about these one-off individual animals. We have these fascinations with a single animal like Tex the bear or the Kananaskis wolf or whatever. And there is never much conversation around the big picture of conservation at a population level. And it's always this glorified stuff of a single animal and some kind of an encounter with a person. Yeah, it's kind of bait type news, if you want to put it that way. I just like to follow it because I like, in a way, to criticize that there's all these stories about one-off animal stories. Of course, somebody getting mauled by an animal is regardless, is always an interesting story to cover, because I think what's couched in that is these bigger issues that I've been talking about, of what's happening on the landscape, how they're being managed, who's interfering with grizzly bear management or predator management, and kind of the lessons maybe that can be learned. At the end of the day, I don't want to see anybody hurt, whether they're a hunter or not. So yeah, I tend to cover those stories, not trying to use them as bait or sensationalize an individual animal. I would like us to be in a position where these aren't always the prime stories, but we are talking about big picture, landscape level conservation issues. Last story, another kind of weird one coming out of the West Coast, is this fella in northern British Columbia found, he's a hunter. He was out doing his thing in the outdoors and found a deadhead. So what's the term for an animal that's died naturally most of the time, be it accident or a predator kill, or died of old age? And he found this stone sheep, 8-year-old ram, so mature ram. And he found the skull in a riverbed in the Peace River area of northeastern British Columbia. So I kind of wonder, maybe, like, the sheep died, drowned in the river, carcass drugged down by a grizzly bear, fell through ice, all of those different types of, scenarios. But he found these set of ram horns, and he went to the government to get a permit for it. His original application, which was in 2023, was denied by a decision maker in the Fish and Wildlife program. And it was determined that the horns were worth more than $200. Because I guess the way I read the story is the individual wanted to, I don't know if he wanted to sell them or he wanted to keep them, but the government decided because they had value, he wasn't allowed to keep them because he could sell them. And that's the threshold for getting a permit for anything that's wildlife, is whether it's above $200 or not. And so he filed an appeal to this board in British Columbia called the Environmental Appeal Board, which you can appeal a decision made under the Fish and Wildlife Act by a decision maker. If you disagree with it, it's a tribunal type board, quasi-judicial, and the board upheld the statutory decision maker's denial of giving this fella a permit for the sheep horns, and said because they're valued above $200 is not eligible to be granted a permit for personal use. So if the permit was for educational or scientific use, I think they could have been issued, but for personal use, no. So weird. What are your thoughts about that? Basically, I think the only thing that this applies to, maybe a couple cases, would be a bird of prey that could be valuable if it was sold. A sheep, a massive trophy bull elk or something like that. There was somebody that found, I think it's like the world record non-typical elk in British Columbia that had suffered a gunshot wound and drowned in a reservoir, and somebody found it or whatever. I don't know whether they got the permit for that. The elk was, I think, later sold to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and it's part of their display of the big record book elk of North America. But I don't know if the person that found it actually got the permit for it. That would have been valued more than $200. Maybe if you found a dead grizzly bear and you wanted the hide and the skulls and the claws, that probably would be denied because it would be worth more than $200. And definitely sheep, and definitely mature rams, there would be a market for those to be sold. And so the average person is not going to get to keep those sorts of things. So, and the unfortunate part about that is if you did keep it and you just stuck it in your rec room and just said, hey, I found this, it's just a cool thing, it's a memento in my den or whatever, technically that's illegal. So, because you don't have a permit for it. Shed antlers, you don't need a permit for. But if they're attached to the skull of an animal, you do, because it's considered wildlife and it's property of the province if it's still attached to the head. Shed antlers aren't. Sheep don't shed their horns, obviously. I guess if you just found a core, a really old one of a sheep horn, maybe you could just keep that like an antler and not need a permit for it. I'd have to check into that. But yeah, so basically folks that are out and about in British Columbia that find sheep skulls on the mountain, it's a pretty good chance, unless it's a little quarter curl or a ewe, you're not going to get to keep it because it's worth more than $200. So let me know what your thoughts are on that. My thoughts is partly I understand the chance that somebody can poach an animal, wire the skull to the base of a tree, let it all decompose and get chewed up, come back the next year and say, oh, look, I found this giant ram skull and it's worth $1,000 or it's worth $5,000. So the law is set up that if it has value from kind of a quote unquote trophy perspective, that you're not going to get a permit for it because it could be a legal way to facilitate poaching. I get it from a law enforcement perspective. But on the other side, to me, 99.99% of the people are people out on the land, recreating, hunting, doing whatever, and they find these things. It already belongs to the public. But, the laws of the elected government says you have to get a permit for it. And it's like you're not getting the permit because you may have done something nefarious to have got it. Maybe you're not telling the truth. Like I said, maybe you shot it the spring before or something and went back and dug up the skull. And it's almost like you're being treated like you've done something wrong. You violated the law by walking in with this ram skull that you found. So I don't like that idea of, a good, honest citizen that happens to find a cool sheep skull that would make kind of a neat piece of, something on the mantle or the wall at home or whatever. And sort of being, sort of question, like, yeah, did you really find this in a riverbed? That bothers me as well. So my thoughts are honest people should be given the benefit of the doubt. They should get a permit for these things, regardless of how big they are. If they want to turn around and sell them, so be it. People pick up shed antlers and sell them for the dog chew market or whatever and make tons of money. Doesn't seem to, bother anybody that's happening. You could have an argument against it, I guess. And if people are doing something illegal, like poaching, a ram and wiring the skull to a tree and coming back, 6 months later, a year later or whatever, I think the chances of that happening are so remote that I would give the benefit of the doubt to the fact that most of the people are walking in have honestly found this animal. And, I think they should be allowed to enjoy it and present it and honor this animal that grew to a certain size and a certain age and died of natural causes. I think that's kind of cool to remember and honor that wild animals are wild because some of them die naturally. And I think that is something that should be honored within somebody's home. So, but let me know your thoughts. Maybe you see it differently, that you don't like people picking this stuff up and being able to sell it. I think it would be easy to fix it. Just say like, yeah, you can have it for personal use. Can't sell it. Easy peasy. Anyways, like I said, this was kind of a weirdly skewed show to kind of weird stories in Western Canada. So maybe next episode will be things that are going on the East Coast. Hopefully they're not weird stories like this. Maybe we'll find some really cool things that are going on in the North or on the West Coast or in the prairie provinces. As always, if you know what's going on in the country and you know all the story, want me to cover it on the show, reach out. I have a new email address that you can access through the new Origins Foundation website. If you haven't heard, our global parent charity, Blood Origins, is now officially known as the Origins Foundation. And that's where you will find us on the web and where you'll be able to reach me. If not, drop me a DM in social media and let me know about a story that you know about. And help me get some information and I'll cover it on an upcoming episode. All right, everybody, you're up to date on what's going on around Canada, and we'll see you in the next episode.